Hello, and I'm Debbie with DK Carr and Associates, and I have the privilege and honor today of speaking with Dr. Roy Shelburne. And I don't know if you know his story. I'm going to give him a moment in a few moments here to tell you his story. But I asked him to come on because with the 21st Century Cures Act, I'm seeing a lot of misinformation being posted on by our Facebook experts. And there's no one that I know better to give us the correct information than Dr. Shelburne. So, Dr. Shelburne, how did you become such an expert on documentation?
They say it's a wise man who learns from his experience. A wiser man still learns from somebody else's. I was not the wiser man. I learned from my own experience. Debbie, again, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for trusting me to be able to share my information. Know you very well and know that you have the best interest of your listeners, your attendees at heart. So thank you for making a part of that. So I began my life in my grandfather's dental hardware store building as a dentist. I opened July the 24th of 1981. Boy, it's hard to say that. You've been so long into the 20s, you always want to say 20s. But yeah, I graduated from dental school, grandfather's hardware store building, lowered the ceiling, put my equipment downstairs in the basement and practiced there with the biggest smile on my face for 27 years. In October 24th of 2003, I flew to San Francisco, California, to the American Dental Association meeting. I was there at the keynote session. Rudolph Giuliani was the speaker. If you remember, that's 2 years after 9/11. He was mayor of New York during 9/11, and he was there speaking on leadership. And I was so into what he was saying that when my phone began to vibrate in my pocket, I didn't notice it, but the person next to me did. They elbowed me and said, "I think your phone's vibrating." And I opened my phone, and it was my wife who was calling. And rather than answering it during the middle of the meeting, I thought it was probably a mistake because she knew I was going to be attending one of these courses and typically would not interrupt. She was visiting my daughter at Virginia Tech at the time. So I closed the phone, waited for Giuliani to finish. I opened my phone and I called home to my wife, and she let me know that the FBI had come to my office, had battered down my back door, and were taking all my records. Learned I was the target of a healthcare fraud investigation, was investigated for 3 years, was then indicted 3 years and 3 days after the search and seizure. Spent a year and a half preparing for the trial, and then went to prison for healthcare fraud, racketeering, and money laundering sentenced to 24 months. I was in a county that was very poor, so we saw a number of Medicaid patients, and in fact, 95% of the people in the county under 18 had Medicaid. So those were my neighbors, my families, and friends. And so I felt obligated to provide care to those individuals covered under Medicaid. Mm-hmm. And they did an investigation over the period of 6 years. And over the 6 years, I was paid $3.5 million for the services I provided. So obviously a very busy Medicaid practice.
Right.
And was found guilty on all charges. The jury's never made aware of the amount. The amount is determined during sentencing, the amount that I got that I wasn't entitled to. And we did make errors that resulted in overpayments in some instances. So of the $3.5 million I was found to have received, when the prosecution established that amount during sentencing, the amount that I got of the $3.5 million was $17,899.57. That's 0.01%. I thought that was a pretty decent error percentage. They didn't think so.
No.
And even though we were able to go over the same 6-year period, do audits of the charts, determine that there was work I did provide, could have billed for, and should have billed for during that 6-year period that totaled about $30,000, it still made no difference. So I spent balance. I spent a lot of time during the period figuring out what was right, what was wrong, what I did that was wrong, what I could have done to prevent it. Have since become an American Dental Association subject matter expert, speaker, writer, consultant. I'm passionate about being the last dental professional who goes to prison for things they didn't know or understand. So share my story, not because I'm proud of it, but because I think it needs to be told, and there are people that need to to benefit. And interestingly enough, Debbie, about 45 minutes before I signed on to this webinar, I got a call from a dentist in Texas who had just learned that they were going to be audited, and there had been somebody who had been disgruntled, a patient who made the complaint, and they have discovered that there were errors that were made. And in the case where this individual who made a complaint, they had made an error in that instance too. So they're awaiting the audit and they needed some guidance. So it happens with greater frequency than most people would care to
It does.
admit or to be concerned about. Yeah, it
It
does. So
does.
that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay, can I ask you one question?
You
You
may.
were at that convention, so did you have any knowledge or any pre-warning? Had you gotten letters or anything that the FBI was investigating you? Your
No,
first
ma'am.
inclination was when they came to, and I try to tell doctors that a lot of times I know of practices where their information had been leaked to the dark web. And the FBI didn't send a letter, they didn't send an email, they came full force and they confiscate everything that is there that's connected to the network. And this mindset of, oh, well, I'll get a letter, you don't always get that knowledge.
Had no idea beforehand. And Debbie, the best offer I ever got to settle prior to going to trial was 3 years in prison and a restitution of $300,000. That was the best offer I ever got to settle. So that wasn't much of an offer. But you're right. In terms of the government, there's to some degree a desire for them to produce shock and awe. And that's not necessarily for just the individual that they're citing, but to send that message out to the community so that everybody's aware. They use tactics that are sensational because they get greater coverage. People look, okay, they're actually taking action. They're working on our behalf. They're taking care of us.
Right.
And in fact, that may not be the case.
Right, exactly. So looking back and what you teach now, why is documentation so important?
If it's not in your clinical record, it completely and accurately, if it's not in the clinical record, it was never said, it was never done, it didn't need to be done, it doesn't exist from a legal perspective. That's the one document that will testify for you very loudly and strongly on your behalf if you put together one that is complete, concise, and covers all the bases. Or it can send you down the wrong path if it contains errors, if it contains erroneous information, if it doesn't document very completely and precisely what you've done. If it leaves things open to interpretation, I guarantee that there will be someone who will interpret it another way. It's like, no, that's not there. This is what you said, but it appears that this is what you mean, when in fact it may not be what you meant at all. So it gives that wiggle room for the person who looks at it and goes, well, that doesn't say that. That says this, or that doesn't say that at all. There was an instance where there were 118 instances the government brought that could have been construed as healthcare fraud. 118, one count of healthcare fraud. So the jury would have had to found me on guilty one of the 118. I would have been guilty of all. And one of the instances was simple restorative. I had done an occlusal composite on tooth number 19. And the issue was the radiograph didn't show the need for treatment. They had an expert witness, a dentist, that testified if the lesion didn't show up on an x-ray, it didn't need to be treated. And I know if you have practitioners out there, how many times have we opened up a little dark dot on the back of a molar, you open it up and you fall into the Grand Canyon, and none of that was evident on the radiograph?
Right.
So the question was what I did to determine that treatment was necessary. And my attorney, to set things up, I was interviewed first. Dr. Shelburne, can you share with the jury what you do to determine treatment is necessary? And I went through the litany. I said, we review the radiographs. That does not always show the lesion. We have instruments that we can use, the little the little reap hook that we use to touch teeth. If an enamel is soft, it means it's diseased. So if we're feeling the tooth and it goes into that area and it gets stuck, it means that area is starting to break down decay. And I said, we can do it visually. We have diagnodent. We have all kinds of different adjuncts to use to be able to determine treatment was necessary. So I defended myself, I thought, very well. And it became the prosecution's turn to punch holes in everything I'd said. And the prosecutor got to this particular patient of the 118, and he said, Dr. Shelburne, he nodded to his AV person who put a copy of my clinical record up. And he said, Dr. Shelburne, is this the patient that you described? I said, yes. He said, by the way, sir, you did a very eloquent and complete job of describing what you did to determine treatment was necessary. By the way, if a prosecuting attorney ever compliments you, what's coming next is not going to be very pretty.
No.
This was one of those instances I go, okay, this is not going to end up very well.
No.
And he asked me to identify in that clinical record that was now before the judge and the jury, the day I did the evaluation, and I said this date, and the day you did treatment, it was on this date. And he said, so can you point out on that clinical record where you made documentation that when you diagnosed the need for treatment of tooth number 19, that you did any of those things that you suggested you did? And I looked at the treatment plan day, and there was just a list of treatments I had suggested. And on treatment day was just the treatment that I provided. It had nothing to do about the diagnosis or the reason, the objective things that I observed that suggested the treatment was necessary. And I said, well, I didn't make notation of any of those things. And the prosecuting attorney turned very dramatically to the jury and said, well, now that you're in this position, I guess we just have to trust your word for it that you did all those things now, right? Had
Right.
I taken the time to document appropriately, that would have testified for me, and that would have taken that allegation off the table. So that's a real life situation where my documentation basically damned me because I did not do what I needed to do.
You know, and that carries over to security inside of the practice, because if you assume that your team members know what they're supposed to do, but it's not in writing, that prosecutor can come up and say, well, no. In fact, I've seen situations where the front desk person said, nobody ever told me, even though all of the other employees say it was talked about at morning huddle for the last week, because it was not documented anywhere and nobody had written out the policy. This is why we stress that practices should have a written security manual, that everybody's on the same page, that everybody knows what's happening. And again, they're not going to look at what you say because they're not going to trust you. And that is going to leave a little hint in the jury. They're going to look at what's in writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's so important. Again, going to our Facebook experts, what are secret notes? Do you have, I've never seen, your notes should be your notes. We shouldn't have separate notes on a patient. Because once a record, and I think that that's something that doctors don't understand. You know, we hear a lot about the record request. Well, I'm not going to send all my notes because the patient's record belongs to the patient. The doctor is the custodian. So if it pertains to the patient in any way, shape, or form, it needs to be documented in writing in that chart, because when a subpoena comes in, I mean, you can attest, they don't come in and say, hey, can we have bits and pieces? I'm assuming that they took your entire chart base. They didn't ask you for, can I have the x-rays and period chart?
In my case, they took the whole chart.
And now it's even easier. Right.
Yeah.
And now it's even easier. Now it's
Mm-hmm.
a database. And, you know, there's ways to audit who's doing what inside those databases. And so we really have more of a view of what's happening. So if you're going to have a secret note somewhere, it's really not secret because the computer knows. It will tell everything.
Absolutely.
But when you mentioned that you had a doctor in Texas that's being audited, Is it possible for insurance companies to send you a letter or show up and say, we want to audit a block of patients?
If you're in network, that participation agreement that you signed with the insurance company gives them the right to do that. So you cannot resist in any way. They, by your signature, and most doctors, if they read the participation agreement, it is only the fee schedule, and they look at the fee schedule and go, can I live with those fees? They determine yes or no, and determine at that point, maybe I can live with it, so I'm going to sign the contract, let alone reading the limitations and restrictions on that plan, which also constrict the amount of payment they're going to receive. But under multiple situations, they don't read that, so they don't
Yeah.
understand that. Heaven forbid they look at the audit part. What doctor in the world wants to think about audits? Well, I'm doing everything right. They're not going to audit me. Of course not. They're going to audit me. Never. No.
And,
So yes, that will
and
give you the right. And if you are not in network, it takes a court order for you to provide that information to the insurance carrier. However, if you decline, your life will never be the same. The relationship with that insurance carrier will change forever. You will be put immediately on focused review, and everything that you submit from that point forward will need so
mm,
much documentation that you will never see the light of day. It's simple
wow.
restorative procedure. They're going to ask for pre-treatment x-rays, post-treatment x-rays. They'll ask for clinical notes of the doctor, and it will take literally weeks and weeks to get the simplest claim process because they put you on focused review. If you resist the invitation to be audited.
That's something that I don't know. I know I see all the time. Doctors have this mindset, it will never happen to me. And
I was that guy.
and that I'm sure the doctor you're dealing with now is, oh my goodness, what did I do wrong? And a lot of times what I see, because I'm only in practices for a very short period of time, and I'm focusing more on the security side, of course. But a lot of times what I see is that the doctor is totally oblivious to what the staff is doing, that they don't really know what their front or what their insurance treatment coordinator is doing, what they're submitting. It is a little tighter now, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't done insurance for a few years. But my understanding is that they're no longer asking for narratives. They're actually asking now for your actual chart notes.
They do. They prefer the clinical record to be able to substantiate the need for clinical care. And to your point about the doctors not knowing what was going on, my business manager was actually asked on. She was one of the people that were called to testify. She was asked if she ever made me aware of any payment that was received that she didn't think was appropriate, and her response was, "No, I never told Dr. Shelburne about any of those because I wasn't aware of any." So
So ignorance is
ignorance is
not
no
bliss.
ignorance is no excuse. No, ignorance is a crosshair and the sights of a regulatory gun on your forehead, basically.
And what we're seeing is more and more regulation coming down. We have HIPAA, of course, we know that HIPAA is going to be revamped. We have the 21st Century Cures Act, which has the information blocking in it. And a lot of these doctors don't realize that the ONC oversees that law, which is the Office of National Coordinator. And the fine is $25,000 per record. And they are doing a lot of marketing to patients because they want patients to be aware that that record belongs to you.
Yeah.
And this idea that we don't have to send the record and we don't have to send, but when we do send, there needs to be the right format. Is it important that the format of the notes be correct? And does it require the doctor to sign it? Should he look at it?
I'm actually on the American Dental Association's informatics committee, and that committee was tasked with putting together the criterion for the clinical record so it would be interchangeable as far as information with physicians, pharmacists, and actually that's going to be mandated. They keep moving that requirement they're kicking the can down the road, but it's going to be here before long. The scary part is there are none of the practice management software companies that are even concerned at this point. They're not going to make the changes until it's absolutely mandated. And talk about scramble and trying to catch up when you're behind the 8 ball. And it's not the software carriers that's going to be fined. It's going to be the dentist that's going to be
Right.
fined because they're not compliant.
Correct.
So just understand, if that gets to the point where it's mandated in dentistry, we're not going to be able to make the deadline because they're aware it's going to be there, but nobody's taking the action to go, okay, understand it's coming, so let's go ahead and get prepared now. There's none of that at this point.
It is a very scary situation. And I know that, in the past, the mindset is it doesn't apply to us. In fact, there was recently a dentist that was fined. He had good attorneys, or his fine would have been a lot more than what he wound up with. But initially, he did not believe that he even had to answer HIPAA, that it didn't apply to him. And that mindset of dentistry is in a hole somewhere by itself is changing rapidly and changing quickly. And it's not just dentistry. I mean, I work with eye doctors, and they're in the same boat, but it's all healthcare. And 2020 showed us what healthcare is. And dentistry is healthcare. As you know, I came out of perio, so I have that systemic link embedded in my head. And so it's definitely all healthcare. So should the doctors review and sign their charts?
In every instance, I've reviewed multiple state dental practice acts, and every one of them that I've seen have a stipulation that the doctor must read and sign each of the clinical entries. And that's in hygiene as well, unless you're in one of the 5 states that hygienists have been given the ability, with the proper education and certification, to diagnose. Otherwise, doctors, you sign your own notes. You have to actually review and sign the hygiene note as well. Hygienists cannot practice independently. They can't diagnose. So if you are doing an evaluation, that calls for a diagnosis. If you're doing the 150, 120, 180, you have to diagnose all conditions that exist. So there again, can the hygienist diagnose? No, unless you're in one of those states that give them that right. So doctors, you have to read and sign the clinical record of the hygienist as well.
So let me ask you this. If you're, as the doctor, as the provider, because we're all electronic now, hopefully, although there are some that are still in, that's a whole different story. But can the doctor just make a little note, write the above chart note for the data service, blah, 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 and sign it that way? Or does he need to physically put his name below? How should he do that?
So that would depend on that criterion established in the practice. So you can, in your log or your standard operating procedures in your practice, if you establish if the doctor's name is typed at the end of that clinical record in your practice, that means the doctor has read, and that is a signature as adopted in your practice. Now that has to be written. Everybody needs to be aware of it, and that also needs to be initialed, signed by all the team as well, so they understand that that's what that means in the practice. You were talking about the training. Everybody needs to be able to sign, yes, but there again, do you have to have the keypad? You don't have to, as long as you have the documentation that in fact this is a standard operating procedure in our practice. When this happens, that is the doctor's signature.
And you have to have the documentation. And if it's not in writing, they're not going to let you just sit up there and go, well, that's our office policy. Well, how do we know that's our office policy? The only way we
There's no
know
such
it.
thing as an unwritten office policy.
Oh, there is a lot. The problem is getting them to write them down. And that's what we're trying to, you and I both, we're just in a different.
We're talking about a legal unwritten office policy. There's no such thing as that. It has to be in writing.
One thing that kind of always has boggled my mind is that we hire new people and we put them in their capacity and we say, okay, sing, go for it, with very limited training and very limited, here's how we do things. And then we wonder why we have the attitudes in the office of, well, this is the way we used to do it at our office. Well, we could curtail a lot of that, I think, if when they come in, we allow an orientation period where we go through everything and we say, you know what, however you did it in your past office, we don't do it that way anymore. This is how we do it here. And here it is in writing, da, da, da.
Yeah.
So,
Ultimately, if you do not have a written policy in your practice, and that's covering all areas,
correct.
then that individual who comes in, they interject their own policy. You don't have
Correct.
one, but I have one, and this is mine.
And we're going to make this one work. Exactly.
Exactly.
And it may or may not be the right policy. And more importantly, it may not be a legal policy. I see all the time, oh, I'm not releasing records without written authorization from the patient. And they come through, well, that can cost a lot of money, and that's under a whole different law. So, documentation. Did I mention documentation? It's just,
no,
it's
you should do that again, I think.
it's so critical. It's so important. And I cannot thank you enough for getting on with me and sharing your story and emphasizing why it's important to have your policies, your processes. And it's not just a policy, it's a process. You need to have our policy is that we're going to secure, but how are we going to do it? Step one,
and this is how you're going to accomplish that. So meeting that policy's requirement.
And I know it can seem overwhelming, but I don't know about you. I tell my clients, take one thing a week. Take one thing a week. And it's okay to admit we didn't have it in place, but now that we're aware, we're working on it. And just take one a week and get going on it, get it in writing, train your team on it, have them initial that they've been trained on it, put it as part of your onboarding when they come in, and document. Everything you do needs to be documented because for lack of a better term, I love you dearly, Roy, it's your get out of jail free card.
It absolutely is.
So
no, that's your stay out of jail free card.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you again so much. Greatly appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you very, very shortly at some upcoming dental meetings.